few years ago, I had just moved into the house I live in now. I moved in around September, and this happened in December. We had just had a large amount of snow, so much so that my work had been closed for the day. I spent the day being lazy around the house and generally not doing anything unless I had to. My basement is set up as a game and TV room, and it's where I was spending most of my day off. I had the TV on while watching something, and I was kind of just laying on the couch, when suddenly, I heard someone banging at the door, loud. I could hear all the way in the basement and above the sound of my surround system. They probably hit the door a good 5 or 6 times. Now, I live in a pretty relaxed neighborhood, super suburban area, and it's quiet as a mouse at night. I had friends dropping by occasionally to see my new house, so I kind of assumed that it was one of them at first, just being an asshole and hitting the door as hard as they could to mess with me. Since it kind of annoyed me that they had been so obnoxious about it, I just sat and watched some more TV, just to let whoever it was sit out there, and if it was a friend, they would call or text, and if it was someone selling cookies or something, then they could piss off. Why someone would be out selling cookies after a snowstorm when the roads were coated in ice, I didn't really think about that, but anyhow, I eventually decided to go up and see if maybe there was something left on the porch, or if it was a friend and they were waiting for me to open the door. I glanced out the curtain, but I didn't see anyone, and so I opened up the door. No one was there and nothing was on the porch. In the street, covered in snow and ice, mind you, was a black Cadillac with about 4 people inside, slowly creeping up the street. One of them was just at the exact moment of climbing in the back of the car as it creeped along. He heard my front door open and looked back at me. He just stared at me until they had moved too far up the street for me to see. I thought it was weird, but I just locked the door and went back to my day off. Later that day, it hit the news that further up my street, about a quarter mile or so, there had been a home invasion. A woman had been asleep upstairs in her house, and the 4 people had thought the house was empty when they broke in. They eventually tied her up and robbed her house at gunpoint. She finally untied herself and went to a neighbor, who then called the police and went back over with another gun to check the place out, but they were already gone. I'm fairly certain that these same 4 people were the ones I saw outside of my house, and if I hadn't decided to go upstairs and open the door when I did, they might have thought my house was empty and kicked my door in instead. I can still see the guy staring at me in the eyes, as if he was weighing the cost of robbing my house, with me in it, against looking for an easier target, but I guess they found one. I've been working at a department store for the past 2 years. Although retail wasn't something I necessarily wanted to do, it was much better than my previous job in the food business, so I was grateful to not have to touch food all day, and I would take the world of customer service much more gracefully than the food industry. It was the middle of January, and the store is usually quite dead towards the end of the day. Usually the following month after Christmas is never really busy, due to people probably not trying to spend money after the gift-giving season, and the cold weather of the winter season. In Canada, it never really helped the situation much. Also, people not in the mood to leave the comfort of their own houses in the middle of a snowstorm. That meant that they put less people on shift, and I was alone in the fitting room. I work at a pretty big store, and alongside the weather conditions, that meant that employees were usually spread out on the floor, not within close proximity in comparison to what they put during the busy season. None of us wore earpieces, as we did most of our paging through the speaker system. It was a Wednesday night around 8, and the store closed at 9. I was usually put on the cash register, but often frequented the fitting room when they needed help. It was a very quiet night, and I spent the first couple hours of my shift helping organize the beauty section that is right next to the fitting room, or speaking to my lovely coworker who worked in the jewelry section, helping the few customers that actually wanted to try clothes on when they came by. There was a man who came to the fitting room with 2 dress shirts, and I didn't think anything of it. After all, he was nothing I've never seen before. Older, tall, kind of stocky and muscular. Just plain. I did notice that he seemed dressed rather nicely though. A clearly expensive suit and a nice shoulder bag. I assumed he must have come to the store after his day at work. I counted the number of articles of clothing that he was bringing in, as that was mandatory in order for me to monitor the flow of clothes and try to stop theft. I handed him a number corresponding to the number of articles he was taking in, and I asked him politely to put the clothes back on the hanger, in French, rather than English, because Quebec requires us to speak French first to customers, to which he replied with a simple "no problem." I noticed he had a thick accent, although I wasn't and still not able to place my finger on it. I think it might have been Russian, but I can't say for sure. The man walked into the fitting room and I didn't really think much of it. I also helped other customers who came out of their rooms counting the articles they came out with and matched it with their numbers, and I hung them back up on their place on the rack. A few moments passed by and the man finally came out. Not really putting much thought into it, I took the clothes back from him as he didn't want any of them, and I took back his number and said thank you, and then I turned to place the clothes on their rack. Usually this was the point where the customer would just leave the fitting room in general, but when I turned around to go back to the front, he was still there. I asked him if there was anything I could do for him, or if he still wanted the shirts that I had just put away. The man just smiled and looked at me, not answering, and I felt a very weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. He was looking at me as if he wanted to say something, and me being the 5'4" girl who hates confrontation of any kind, I just nervously laughed and started to organize the desks at the front of the fitting room entrance, awkwardly arranging all the numbers, although they were already in order. He asked me for my name, to which I just looked down at the name tag I was wearing and repeated it. He told me it was a beautiful name. I laughed nervously, never knowing what to do in these sort of situations, and I just wanted to be nice to him, as it was a part of my job in customer service. Besides, he didn't technically do anything wrong, he just complimented me. I said thank you and I looked away, avoiding eye contact. He then just stood there for what felt like 20 minutes, but in reality it was probably only 3. He stood there as I helped other customers, and it was beginning to make me very uncomfortable. Not wanting to be rude, but also not wanting to subject myself to being uncomfortable for the rest of my shift, or however long he was planning to be there. I asked him if there was anything else he needed help with. Here's when I began to get really scared. He proceeded to tell me that he will be waiting for me at 9:30 outside the doors of our store, and he wanted to take me out. Confused, I looked at him oddly. How did he know that we finished at that time? The store closed at 9 and we usually spent 30 minutes cleaning up the store. I suppose that information isn't super hard to guess, but it still felt weird. Why did he want to take me out? I once again laughed nervously because that seemed to be the only thing I was able to do when uncomfortable, and I politely declined, saying I had to get home and study. He then laughed, taking a step closer to me, and I instinctively took a step back. He didn't accept my answer because he just smiled once more. I'll be waiting for you outside the door where all the employees leave from, in the truck alley. I'll be right there. There was a door that employees exited the mall from because the normal doors were usually locked around 9:15, and we always finished later than that, so we take the door that takes us in a slight alley where all the trucks go to drop off shipments for our store. Being someone who hates confrontation and who doesn't do well with controlling my emotions, I felt myself start to tear up at this exact comment. No employee is allowed to mention the door we leave from, it's a company rule. Since we usually finish late and the parking lot is dark, they don't want anyone to know where we exit from as a precaution. I told him once more that I appreciated his offer, but I wasn't interested, and I had to continue my work. I politely told him to leave when he put a hand on my shoulder, and I felt myself freeze up. I remember thinking and just praying that one of my coworkers would show up, or the jewelry employee would stop filling the cases and turn around. With my luck though, nobody did. He told me I was a beautiful girl and that he couldn't wait to meet me in the alley at the end of my shift. He also said that he has a nice apartment and had a cute dog, as if the dog was going to make me change my mind and we could have a fun time. At this point, being absolutely desperate, I said I have a boyfriend and he was going to be picking me up, hoping that would deter him, but he just laughed. He said my name and then told me that wasn't something that usually stopped him. I honestly really began to feel scared, and I excused myself to use the phone on my desk, shaking his hand off of me that I hadn't realized was gripping on me so tightly. I paged the number for my coordinator, who curtly replied before I was even able to get a word in that she was busy with a customer and hung up. Unsure of what to do, as the man was still next to me, as he followed me to my desk, I called my manager, who thankfully replied. When he saw that I was speaking with someone on the phone, he left the fitting room, but that didn't make me feel any better. I told my manager what happened, and with good reason she freaked out, telling me I need to report him immediately, reminding me with people like that I have to be really careful. She told me to call security, and I did. The security guard told me he had an eye on him through the camera. It was around 8:30 at this point, and I was getting ready to start my closing tasks, still paranoid about what the man had said. This sounded like the beginning of an abduction movie to me, honestly. I eventually calmed down a little bit, not seeing the man anymore, when the security guard called me back. He wanted to let me know that the man had never left and was circling the store. I felt more dread than before pop up in my stomach. He didn't leave. Thankfully, he hadn't come back to see me, though. It felt kind of better for the fact that the security guard had seen him, so if anything did happen, there was at least someone who was able to identify him. By the time the store closed and it was time to leave, two of my coworkers, Evan and Ethan, two boys who worked in the warehouse, made sure to walk with me all the way to my car, not letting me be alone. I appreciated that a lot. Although I didn't want to admit it, I was scared walking through the alley, and I was even paranoid he was going to follow me home. I took the extra long route to see if anyone was trailing me, which he wasn't. When I walked through the safety of my door of my house and locked it behind me, I let go of a breath I wasn't even aware I was holding in. I make sure nowadays to leave the store using the buddy system. I never walk alone, and I always make sure I'm hyper aware of my surroundings. I never wear my name tag anymore. Luckily, nothing happened to me, and maybe I was overthinking the entire experience, but I wanted to stress that even if your job is in customer service, if someone makes you feel uncomfortable, speak up. You should not have to be subjected to this kind of behavior at your work, or anywhere for that matter. I'm a woman, and I was 52 at the time of this. I was traveling by car to an out-of-town job assignment. I had stopped at a popular and busy gas station to fill up the car, stretch my legs, and use the restroom, and probably grab a snack. I was approached by a developmentally disabled woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. She was looking for a ride to a town a couple of towns over. I guess her ride had abandoned her while she was in the restroom. That was her story, at least. She was a little bit upset, and she didn't have a cell phone and didn't know any phone numbers so I could call someone to help her. I checked with the employees at the store, and they said that she had been there for over an hour looking for a ride because she said her friends left her while she was in the restroom. I then made the decision to do something I've never done before: offer a stranger a ride. I wasn't going to the town that she wanted to go to, but I was heading in that general direction. I told her I could drop her off at the grocery store in the next town where I would be turning off to go to my destination. The store was always busy, and it was very likely she'd have an easier time getting a ride to where she wanted to go. Also, she'd be 5 miles away from where she wanted to go instead of the 25 miles originally, and she would obviously have an easier time walking that distance if she had to. This was agreeable to her, and we set off. Right away, I noticed a van following us. I tried to lose the van, but it kept pace. Meanwhile, the woman wanted to play with my phone. I told her no, that it wasn't a toy, it was for work, and I moved it out of her reach. The van speeds up and starts to get closer. The woman suddenly remembers her boyfriend's phone number, and we need to call him. I can't use my phone while driving. This was pre-car sync era, and I was approaching the outskirts of the business district of the next town, and no cell phone use while driving signs were everywhere. I told her, we're almost to the grocery store, so we can call him from the parking lot when we get there. She becomes agitated and yells, "No, you have to take me home." I told you I can't do that, though, I said. I'm not going there. It's in the opposite direction of where I need to go, and I'm expected soon. We'll call him from the parking lot, like I said. After this, she becomes more upset and frustrated, and the van is now getting closer. I pull into the grocery store parking lot, and it's about 4 p.m. The store is busy. I pull up in the front of the store and ask for her boyfriend's number. Suddenly, she can't remember his number. She won't get out of my car, and now she's arguing with me, and the van is pulling into the parking lot. Out of sheer luck, there's a sheriff's deputy parked nearby, and I roll down my window and signal that I need to speak to him. He walks over and asks me what's going on. I tell him where I met this woman, and now she won't get out of my car, and under my breath, I tell him the van has been following us. The deputy tells the woman, "She brought you where you asked her to, now it's time for you to leave her car." She slowly gets out of the car, and I ask once more for her boyfriend's number, and she says, "You're crazy, I don't have a boyfriend." "Oh look, there are my friends now." And she points to the damn van. The deputy and I share a look, and he says, "Give me your contact info. I can delay them for about 20 minutes while I check their license and registration and lecture them about abandoning a special needs adult. You get out of here and I'll check on you before my shift is over. And don't pick up any more hitchhikers. I left and went on to my destination. He later called me to make sure I got to where I was going and told me that they were keeping an eye on the van and its owner. He told me he also contacted a colleague at the sheriff's department in the county where I was working and that she should contact me in a day or two. While I was on assignment there, I spoke to 2 deputies and a detective about the woman and the van. No one ever told me anything about them, but they were very interested in them. My nightmare is one day I'll turn on a true crime show and see a report about this woman and her gang robbing and killing people. There's an unspoken rule up in the mountains that no matter who you are, friend, bitter rival, stranger, anyone, if you're ever in a pinch and come across another hunter's cabin, you're welcome to seek shelter there. Maybe it's unspoken because it's common courtesy and that whole do unto others thing. Or maybe it's unspoken because there's hardly anyone to speak to, in the winter months especially. You'd be hard-pressed to see another soul for weeks, sometimes even months. But that's the rule. You need it, you use it. No judgment, no questions asked. Just don't steal anything. Now, I'm not a burly, seasoned mountain man that flosses with tree bark and never shaves, but I do like to hunt. I often leave my small Alaskan village for weeks at a time and take to my hunting lodge up in the mountains. I'm a fairly cautious guy, and I know the mountains can be traitorous, so when I leave prepared. I check the long-term forecasts and gather the necessary supplies, bring backups, and make sure I've got enough of everything that I need to survive at least a week longer than I plan on staying, just in case. I always believed that my precautions would protect me, but like a child's security blanket, they were only a paper-thin illusion of safety. There's really no planning when Mother Nature decides she's in a mood. That's why I never expected to get caught in a blizzard this day. It had started out sunny and cold, but as the day progressed, a few clouds formed. By the time they had massed into a heavy cloud covering, I was already on my way back to my cabin, with a couple of hairs hanging over my shoulders. I'd named them dinner and breakfast. I was planning on eating breakfast for dinner and dinner for breakfast, if only to make myself laugh. It's the little things like that that keep solitude from turning into loneliness. The snowfall seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone had knocked an awning shut and all the snow collected on top had fallen all at once. Except it wasn't a single tidal wave of snow, it was a relentless, unending assault. Last I checked, the weather reports hadn't mentioned a blizzard, and yet a blizzard was what I found myself walking through. It got very dark, very fast, and I kicked myself for leaving my flashlight back at my lodge. I'd planned on coming home long before nightfall, so I hadn't thought I needed it. I'd been sorely mistaken. Snow prickled painfully as it darted into my eyes. I had squinted almost all the way to keep those sub-zero jerks from stabbing me blind. The wind howled as gales cut through my clothes and right to my bones. I could barely see 2 feet in front of me, and I couldn't see the 2 feet beneath me as they sank in an ever-growing blanket of white. I'm not sure when I realized I was lost. At some point I knew I should have arrived at my cabin, but all I saw was white with a few slivers of gray swaying in the thick breeze. The hairs at the back of my neck became stiff and battered against me with every puff of air and every awkward crashing footfall. I was running out of energy, running out of ideas, and beginning to panic. I could have spun around in a computer chair 100 times and felt less disoriented than I did in that whiteout. Then I walked right into a cabin, literally. It had become so dark and the snow had become so heavy that I couldn't see the structure until I stumbled face first into it. I held my hands against the wood so I wouldn't lose it in the storm and circled around until I found a door. I wasn't just in a pinch, this was life or death. In the unlikely event someone was inside, I knocked on the door and waited for an answer. Through the howling wind, I could have sworn I heard, "Come in." As I swung open the door and stepped inside, a small avalanche of snow tumbled in with me. I didn't bother trying to kick it out as I fought against the wind to close the door behind me. The relief was instantaneous. Without the air whipping at me, I'd put a stop to the timer ticking down to my freezing death. "Thanks," I whispered. I turned towards the inside of the cabin and tried to get my bearings, but all I saw was blackness, which meant I had no real way of gauging the size of the cabin. Yeah, I'd circled around it, but I'd been stumbling around, half blind, focused on trying to find a doorknob, so I had no idea what length of the cabin I'd covered. I could have walked half of it. I could have circled around it 3 times without realizing it. Through the darkness, all I could see was the vague outline of someone sitting in the corner. "Hey, you're a real lifesaver," I said. He didn't answer. I pawed around for a lighter, a lantern, a matchbook, anything that might emit light, but all my fingertips touched were chains in the barrels of hunting rifles. I stopped poking around when I felt an open bear trap. Wouldn't want to get my arm caught in one of those. It was safer to sit still and wait for daybreak. It occurred to me that the stranger might have been seeking refuge as well, so I started, keeping my tone light and innocent. "You the owner of this cabin?" The answer was more of a hiss than a word, but in that hiss, I heard a faint yes. I sat on the floor, let my hairs down beside me, and reached into my pack. Why I'd taken a sleeping bag with me and not a flashlight was beyond me. I removed my wet clothes and quietly slipped into the sleeping bag to warm me up, making conversation as I did. "Hey, thanks again," I said. "That blizzard really came out of nowhere." He replied with the slow, labored, wheezy breaths of an elderly man on his deathbed. "Dangerous." "Yeah," I chuckled. "That's an understatement." "Hungry," he exhaled. "You got a fireplace?" I asked. "I've got a couple of hares. I'll cook them up. It's the least I can do." His reply was drawn out, like a wolf howling, but without the majestic hum. "No." "Okay, as soon as the blizzard dies down, I'll go gather wood and make us a fire. Can you wait until then?" I saw his silhouette shift slightly. There was a rattle of chains. "No." Again, the O stretched out in a long, bloated groan. "No. No, yes." The final no morphed strangely into a yes, like someone drastically changing to a much higher note on a flute, halfway through a breath. I craned my neck to look at the single window in the cabin. It was pitch black, or pitch white. It was like an afterglow, visible against the black backdrop of the wood, yet still inherently dark. I focused on it rather than the rest of the cabin because it was the only hint of light I could see. "If you don't mind, I'm going to try to catch some shut-eye," I said tiredly. He didn't respond, but that didn't surprise me. Mountain folk don't talk much, even when they come down to town for what few supplies they can't make themselves. I shrugged it off and settled in for the night, but I felt something hard against my side. Sighing, I tossed my hairs back a bit farther and got comfortable. I was exhausted, so it wasn't all that hard for me to drift off, despite the wind song playing outside the walls. I hugged myself in my sleeping bag and drifted off. I was awoken by a different sound, a weird snapping crunch that made me shoot up in my bed. Believing the ceiling was about to collapse under the weight of the snow, I braced myself, but as the sound came again, I realized it wasn't above me, but rather next to me, near my belongings. The silhouette was gone from the corner, and I could hear his deep, raspy breaths accompanying the crunch. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. He retreated back to his corner with a rattling of chains. My adrenaline was pumping, and I wasn't even sure why. Something about the stranger put me in a state of near panic. My instincts were telling me to leave, but I truly couldn't afford it. Whatever this guy was up to, I was safer with him than I was out there in that blizzard. I grabbed my backpack and propped myself against the wall in a seated position, staring at the silhouette, expecting him to make a move. I kept myself awake and alert, never looking away, even as the howling wind slowly diminished in strength. Once or twice, I felt my head begin to dip and my eyes begin to shut, but every time I slipped, the faint rattle of chains snapped me back into consciousness. As the blizzard cleared and the sun slowly rose, light began to trickle into the cabin. The scene filtered through in tiny increments with each layer uncovered by the sun, like a printer slowly spitting out the full picture one line at a time. I wasn't even in a cabin. I was in a large supply shed that was maybe 10 to 11 feet long and 7 to 8 feet wide. There was no fireplace, which makes sense for a supply shed. There were tools, traps, and rifles lining every wall. The silhouette in the corner slowly stopped being a silhouette and started being a distinct person. Skinny. No, actually gaunt. Pale. No, actually ghost white. Man. No, it was a corpse. I was gutted. He was dead, Not, oh shoot, I died overnight. Sorry about that, dead. Like long dead. Long dead. His body was all shriveled and mummified, if that's even the right word for it. He wasn't wrapped up in bandages or anything like that, but his skin was completely dehydrated and stiff like an unwrapped mummy. His hair was hanging from his head in unkempt strings. His teeth were poking out of his shrunken lips, with a wide gap where the top right canine should have been. There was a stain of age-old blood soaked in the wood beneath him. I followed it by gaze to its origin, his left foot, and the bear trap in which it had been gotten caught. There was an empty hook on the wall above him with a chain leading to the trap. It was long enough for him to move around, but not enough for him to reach the front door, or the saw hanging above it. My best guess was the trap had fallen on its own while he was out, and at some point he'd done a supply run in the dark, and probably had gotten caught in his own trap. He probably died of thirst or something. Look, I'm telling you, he wasn't breathing, and he wasn't moving. He was dead as a doornail, and had been for quite some time. I sat there, reasoning I'd been delirious the night before. The fatigue, the dehydration, the disorientation caused by the blizzard. It made me imagine a voice. Those slow hissing sounds I thought were replies were just the wind outside. I interpreted them wrong because the loneliness had finally gotten to me. The elements had conspired against me to create a living person out of someone who definitely wasn't living. It was a good logical explanation, and I wish I could say it was true. I'm an avid hunter. I go every season and I love it. More often than not, I don't kill any game, but I just love getting out in the woods. I don't know if you're familiar with hunting seasons in Pennsylvania, but during late November, rifle season is in full swing. It was already the second week of the season, and I had yet to bag any deer, so I was eager to get to it early in the morning. And I did. I normally get up around 5 a.m. and drive to my hunting spot. It's private land that my grandfather owns, and him and I are the only two to hunt on it, and the rest is posted to hunters. The only others on the land are employed on my grandfather's farm. I had originally planned on calling my grandfather when I woke up and asking him if he wanted to tag along, but the weather that morning was horrendous. The snow was pouring down and the wind was really strong. You see, I love hunting in the snow, but it almost made me decide not to go, so I knew he wouldn't want to. The roads were really bad, so it took me a bit longer to drive there. Normally, the sun would be starting to rise by now, however it was overcast and snowing. Regardless of the snow, I walked up to my spot. It was directly behind my grandfather's house, over a hill and back about 100 to 150 yards. Almost immediately upon sitting in my spot, I hear things moving all around me. Honestly, I didn't pay it much mind. It could be any number of things, but it was still pitch black, and the thought that it was a deer had crossed my mind, but there wasn't much I could do. It's not like I can shoot at it, so I just ignore it and continue to wait. It wasn't much longer after that I began hearing something walking just over the ridge to my right. At this point, there's barely enough light to see my feet, so even if it was a deer, there was still nothing I could do. However, I could tell it wasn't a deer. I just assumed it was my grandfather walking to his spot, which is just a short walk from mine. But the lights in his house were off, and if he was hunting up here, I'm sure he would let me know prior. But even if it wasn't him, it was a hunter, albeit hunting illegally. I still wanted to let him know I was there, so I turned on my flashlight and pointed it in his direction, flashing it several times. Again, even if it was a deer, I couldn't shoot it, so I felt it was better to be safe rather than sorry. Nothing much happened after that. After I flashed my light, the noise stopped, which was really odd. I didn't hear them turn back, so I figured they either A, sat down right there after seeing my light, which is considered extremely rude, or B, I didn't hear them walk off. I just assumed it was the latter. An hour or so passes, and finally the first sights of daylight start to shine through. It's still snowing and the snow is falling in entire snowballs rather than snowflakes, so visibility is pretty limited. But I just grinned. I love snow, and even if I couldn't see any deer, I still found the weather beautiful. It was around this time that I noticed an odd-looking lump protruding out from a group of trees and shrubs atop the hill that separates me from my granddad's house, right where I had heard movement earlier. It looked like a mound of dirt, however it was sticking out from the side of a tree, so it obviously wasn't dirt. Naturally, I raised my rifle up to take a closer look. I could immediately tell that I was looking at the side of an older style camouflage coat. It took a minute, but it finally clicked. That was a person over there. I just thought it was a hunter, so I didn't know what to do about it. I knew he was hunting on our land illegally, and from what I could see, he wasn't wearing anything orange, which is required of all hunters during the rifle season. And I could tell just from looking, whoever this wasn't my grandfather. I sat there for a minute debating my next move, but I decided to call my granddad at the risk of blowing his hunt, if that was him over there. So without taking my eyes off this guy, I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. To my dismay, he picked up, and I told him what was going on. So he told me he'd make his way up, but I decided to go on my own to give the guy a whistle to let him know I see him, but he didn't react at all. After a few minutes, I started to walk up to this guy. After walking the short distance, I could clearly see him. He was sound asleep, tucked in between a shrub and a couple of trees. He obviously thought out where to lay down, as I would have never have been able to see him had his coat not stuck out. And as I thought, he had no orange on. I gave him another whistle, much louder, and he woke right up, almost immediately shuffling over to hide his exposed coat. He had a nasty scruffy beard and a gray hat. Honestly, he looked like a harmless old homeless man, probably in his 50s. But he had a perfect view of my granddad's home from his spot, and I have a pretty good idea what he was planning to do once my granddad left the house. Once this guy realized he had been caught though, and saw a mad 6'5" guy carrying a hunting rifle less than 10 yards away, making his way closer, his face went pale. Almost instantly, he tried to feed me some bullshit that he had gotten lost during a drive with a group of other hunters. For those of you that don't know, a drive is a coordinated push through a thicket in order to drive deer to hunters sitting at the end of the designated driving area. However, the closest public game land is miles from this spot, so I knew this was a lie. He just kept on going about how he was lost and how he fell asleep. He even went as far to make up a fake name on the spot. I just stood there and listened, making sure he didn't make any fishy movements. I couldn't help but think about what this guy could have done to my grandfather. God knows he had the chance, and that thought pissed me off enough to tell the guy to shut the hell up. That's about the point where I saw my granddad. My granddad is a tough old bastard, so my first thought was, this idiot is going to get himself killed. Luckily, nothing happened. After he got there, we practically had to drag this guy down the road, where my granddad called the cops and I called my dad. Technically, this guy hadn't done anything wrong yet, so all we could charge him with was trespassing and stalking. That was about a month ago, and since then, I haven't heard anything else about him.